Hey, welcome. This is Mike Jones, teaching Biology 121, AP1 from Grand Rapids Community College. And the winter semester of 2021, that's me again. Yes, I decided to dress up as some of you may see me. You may believe that this is the crown that I wear more often than you wish to admit. I just thought I'd put a little fun in there, have a little laugh. But this is going to go away. All right. We are on to our next subject. Our next subject is the integumentary system. Now we're really getting into actual systems of the body. You know, not just cells, not just energy sources. We're really going to get into how cells work, how the various tissues of the body, how do they make a body? How do they work together? What do they do? What are their special functions? So I'm going to get this going into a full slideshow, I believe. Right? Yes, there we are. And I'm still there. Excellent. So far, so good. Next thing, got to have my laser pointer. Right. So the first slide I have to show you is this is being recorded just after our latest NASA rover has made it to Mars. It's on Mars, and our little dude is sending pictures back. Here's the first shot from Mars. Not very impressive. Our kid isn't much of a photographer yet, but they'll be working on that. Anyway, made it in there. It landed. The camera works. Everything's good. Congratulations, NASA. Way to go. Woohoo! I'm kind of a geek about that kind of stuff. Always wanted to be an astronaut as a kid. Not that I wanted to go to Mars, but I love this stuff. Anyway, there it is. Congratulations, NASA. Way to go. Okay. So skin. So when we talk about the integumentary system, what we mean is what you're going to think of as skin. Right? You're going to say, oh, that's my skin. There's so much more to the integumentary system than just skin. However, yes, it's your skin. And there are other constituents as a part of your skin. When we refer to your skin, also, we refer to it as a cutaneous membrane. Now, cutaneous is this word that means on the outside or toward the surface. So if something is cutaneous, so we say cutaneous innervation. We'll say, cutaneous sensation, cutaneous activity of sweat glands or something like that. Cutaneous. And so that's what we're referring to. We're referring to the outside of your body and the associated skin and tissues with that. It is pretty much the largest organ of your body in terms of, I guess, in terms of weight and in terms of the size of it. It covers your entire body, of course. So it is an organ system all on its own. And it is called, as I had already said, it's called the integumentary system. When we're talking about the system, we're talking about the skin. That includes the epidermis, the dermis, and includes all of the organs that are associated with those structures. Now you pretty much have two parts to the skin. Now there's a third layer that we get into, and we don't really consider it part of the skin. But then it's hard to say, well, what's it a part of? Well, we'll get to that. But for sure, without a doubt, two parts to the skin. You have the epidermis, which is the outside, the epidermal layer, and the dermis. The dermis is right underneath the epidermis. Now you're going to, these are two distinct layers. They're very, very thin, but they're very strong. It's very necessary to have a good connected cellular system between the dermis and epidermis. We're going to talk about their specifics. All right, so here's a micrograph of what skin looks like, right? This is a cross section. So we've sliced through the skin, and we've stained it in a particular way, and then we put it under a microscope. And we show it to you. The epidermis, of course, is the outer layer. Epi, always meaning the outer part. There are epicondyles. There is epidermis. Anything that's epi is toward the surface. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is on the outside of your body, but epidermis means that it's toward the outside of whatever tissue you're talking about, toward the outer aspect of that tissue. And so, as it says, outer layer. It is composed of cells. Now, you should have, in lab, you should either be going through or already have gone through all of the tissue types that you have to know about. Right, and all the tissue, all in the body, there's 4 tissue types, right? There's epidermal tissue, there is connective tissue, there is muscle, and there is nerve. And everything in your body is one of those 4 types. Everything in your body can fit into one of those categories. The outer part of your skin, of course, fits into the epidermis, the epidermal layer. It is made of stratified squamous epithelium. You know, squamous cells are flat. And so you would figure, well, your skin would be flat. It turns out, though, that the first layer of skin, if you will, and it is layered, even within, we have epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous layer. Your epidermis really is made up of several different layers, and we're going to talk about that. But generally, we think of it as a stratified squamous epithelium. That means there are lots of flat cells all piled on top of each other. So that's the outer part here. So here's stratified squamous epithelium. And then the dermal layer has 2 layers to it. And those 2 layers are, of course, mostly connective tissue. A lot of it is dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense meaning that it's pretty strong. Irregular meaning it runs in, it's not a very, straight, strong, linear structure, like a tendon or a ligament. Those are regular connective tissue that have a directionality to the fibers. Here with the dermis, the dense irregular tissue is sort of spread out in all kinds of different directions, but that gives it strength in all of those directions. That's why you can take your skin. Sorry to use this as a demo, but if you take your skin and pull on it, the reason it doesn't tear apart is because, or at least one reason is because you have dense irregular connective tissue that is strong, but it is strong in a variety of directions. As a connective tissue, of course, connective tissue means you have collagen, collagenous fibers, and elastic fibers. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens as you age is that you start to lose those elastic fibers, and so your skin is not as resilient, and it doesn't snap back as quick as it did when you're older as it did when you're younger. That's where wrinkles come from. That's part of the aging process. Underneath that is either what we refer to as the hypodermis, hypo meaning it's underneath the dermis, or we often refer to it as a subcutaneous layer. Most of this is an insulating fat layer. This is where most of the fat of the skin is held. As it says here, it's not considered a part of the skin. We typically don't refer to the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer as skin or part of the integumentary system. However, it is an important layer, and we're going to talk about its importance in a bit. So this is an actual micrograph of what skin really looks like, the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Now, this slide is more of obviously a graphic representation, or just a picture. As I've said, it's the integumentary schematic. How is it built? So these are the various layers, and we just talked about the 3 big components or layers that the integumentary system includes, and it includes the epidermis out here. Now we're going to get to all of these other layerings in a moment. But the epidermis is on the outside, toward the surface of the skin. And the surface of the skin is, up here, is literally the surface of the skin. And then as you go deeper, 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 now you're getting down deeper into the epidermal layer until you get to the first layer, as it were, of the epidermis, and that's called the stratum basale. So the stratum basale is where actively mitotic cells grow from here, and create new keratinocytes that layer on top of each other as you go up. We're going to talk about these other structures. But that's the epidermis. Below the epidermis, here's the dermis. The dermis has 2 layers. Here's one layer up right underneath the basement membrane of the epidermis. And then below that is another layer made of more of an areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is a lighter, more frilly, easier for things to get through layer, if you will. And then below that, of course, is the subdermal layer, or the hypodermis. That's where it's really easy for larger blood vessels or vasculature to get through the hypodermis, sending a lot of capillaries up into the dermis. But remember, like epidermal tissue everywhere throughout the body is avascular. Avascular means without vascularity, no blood vessels. So the epidermis up here does not have blood vessels in it. I know you've cut your skin, you've scraped your skin, and you say, oh my gosh, I bleed. That's because you scraped further down than just the epidermis. If you scrape just the epidermis, you will not bleed. There's no blood there. It is in the dermal layer where you're going to start to see vasculature. So you have to abrade or cut yourself deeper than the epidermis in order to bleed. You have to get into the dermis. This is also where, if you're going to get a tattoo, you have to put the ink into the dermal layer. It's got to get down here. The dermal layer is not part of the system of the epidermis where you get cell layering, and of course the outer cell layer with its keratinocytes is shed. You take a shower, you put on a sweater, you wash your hands, you are shedding this outer layer of cells constantly shedding them, but they're dead. You don't care, they're dead. The deeper layer of cells, these are the cells, the stratum basale is the layer of cells that it's actively mitotic and is going to replace those upper layer of cells, and they are going to move up through this layering system until they themselves become keratinocytes and they are shed through normal processes. But if you're going to have a tattoo, you must get the ink down this low. It's got to penetrate into the dermal layer. So this is the schematic. All right. Now you have other structures. So again, let's orient yourself. Every time you see a picture, of course, you should orient yourself to what are you looking at. All right. Well, so we have the outer skin here, and this is epidermis. There are other structures here. We're going to get to that in a moment. Below the epidermis is the dermis. Right, so the epidermis is pretty thin, even though it's a lot of cell layers. We're going to talk about how many cell layers. A lot of cell layers, but it's still quite thin because these stratified squamous epithelial cells are very thin and they are very compact. Below that's dermis with its two layers. We'll talk about what those two layers are. And then the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis, sometimes referred to, with its fatty presentation. Easier to get blood vessels through their larger blood vessels. And then capillaries, lots and lots of capillaries will penetrate into the dermis, but not into the epidermis. All right, you have hair follicles. Here's a hair shaft and a hair follicle. We're going to talk about what a hair follicle is. You've got sweat glands here, and they penetrate up to the surface. We're going to talk about what a sweat gland looks like and how it works and how it acts. We're going to talk about the layers of the epidermis. You see this sort of wavy appearance at the base of the epidermis. A lot of that has a name too. We're going to get into what that's called. In fact, it says it right here. That's called the Dermal Papilla. So papilla is a word that means like a pimple. If something is like a pimple, it's called a papilla. Well, these are like lots of little pimples. Highs and lows and highs and lows and highs and lows to the skin, so that if I take the skin and I push it in one direction or push it in another, or pull it up, or I'm stretching my wrists or my fingers or something, my skin is constantly moving and being pulled in all these different directions. It needs to be able to spread out and then recover and recoil back to its original size. That's partly what the papillary layer is for, the dermal papilla. There's another reason it's there, and we're going to get to that in a moment. Below all of this stuff are muscles, right? So we get into the muscular layer below the subcutaneous or hypodermis level. Now, if you get a burn, we're going to talk about burns too. If you get a burn, if you, we label burns, or we define burns based on the depth of the burn. And we're going to talk about how we categorize that, but it has to do with this layering system and how far down you have damaged this tissue because of the burn. All right, so some definitions. Epidermis, stratified squamous epithelium, rests on a basement membrane, lacks blood vessels. There are no blood vessels. It is avascular, like all epidermal tissue everywhere, all over your body. The deepest layer is called the stratum basale. Some people refer to say the basale as if it were, Latin or an Italian term. I say stratum basale. Now, it's nourished by blood vessels in the dermis, right? So, things diffuse, nutrients diffuse from the capillaries in the dermis, and nutrients and whatever other things are necessary to maintain mitotic, actively dividing cells that will diffuse from the capillaries in the dermis. As the cells grow, they migrate toward the free surface. That means upwards. So this is the bottom layer of the epidermis. As they migrate, older cells, the keratinocytes, begin to flatten and die. And they're called keratinocytes because they make this stuff called keratin. Keratin's a protein. It's a tough, fibrous, waterproof protein made and stored in the cells. So keratinocytes, as they get toward the surface, they are referred to keratinocytes because they keratinize. They're making that protein, and they become harder, dehydrated. Keratin accumulates in the epidermal cells as they migrate outward. So this becomes a protective barrier. Cells reach the outer surface, they become tightly packed, of course. They flatten out, flatter and flatter and flatter, and become, they're still quite closely connected to each other. And they have this waterproof, yes, you can go through the argument of, is it really waterproof? Well, it's pretty water resistant. It takes a long time for water to soak in. Go ahead and sit in the tub or sit in the pool for quite a while. Yes, your skin will absorb the water in there. So it's not perfectly waterproof, but it's pretty water resistant. Now, as we go higher and higher, you get to the outer layer. The outermost layer is called the Stratum Corneum. Remember those connections between cells? Desmosomes are extremely important in the skin because they really add a lot of physical strength to the skin itself and allow it to move around but keep it together. So when I do this, I'm not ripping my skin apart. Stratum corneum cells are eventually shed from the skin surface. Of course, those are the cells that are shed by washing. All right, now your skin, where's it thickest? Of course, it's thickest where you would imagine, on your palms and on your soles. Where your weight-bearing surfaces, especially in the bottom of your feet, they're going to be very, very thick there. Your palms are not quite as thick, but they are thicker than most of the other areas of the body of the epidermis. Still, when we say thick, what are we talking about? We're talking about 0.07 to 0.12 millimeters. That's thick? Yep, thick enough. All right, 5 cell layers in the epidermis. You already know 2 of them. You know the base one, where the actively mitotic cells are called the stratum basale. The stratum basale is the deepest layer, and it hugs the border of the basement membrane as the basement membrane rides its way over the top of the dermis. One single cell layer, stratum basale. On top of that is stratum spinosum. So this layering system, if you go from stratum basale up, you're literally going up toward the surface. If you start at the stratum corneum and work your way down, you're literally working your way down layer by layer. I have a mnemonic, a memory device to remember this. If you start from the outer layer, And they're all stratum, right? So stratum is the first word. So we forget stratum in the layering system, or in my mnemonic. Right? So you have the Stratum Corneum, the Stratum Lucidum, Stratum Granulosum, the Stratum Spinosum, and Stratum Basale. Now, it is true here, Stratum Lucidum is only on the thicker parts of skin, on the soles and on the bottom of your feet. However, despite that, we're going to emphasize that point, of course. But you want to remember these? Here's the mnemonic that I use. So we start out here. Come, let's get sunburnt. Now, you shouldn't get sunburnt. I don't want you to be sunburnt, but that's the way to remember it. Come, let's get sunburnt. Come, let's get sunburnt. First letter of all of these layers. Now, functions, right, protects against water loss because you have a waterproof or at least quite a water-resistant surface. If you didn't have that, your blood vessels would be closer to the surface and you would be diffusing fluids out of your body like crazy. This is one of the problems with people who have severe burns. They do tend to get dehydrated quite easily as they're recovering. So it protects against water loss, protects harmful chemicals. It's a pretty good shield for harmful chemicals. Mechanical injury and pathogens. Extremely important. I cannot overemphasize how important it is to protect your body against these pathogens. They have to get through there, and a lot of them can't get through, and so that's your protection. So here's the layers in a table form, right? Come, let's get sunburned. Stratum lucidum. Remember, that's only in the thick skin areas. So the soles of your feet and the palms of your hand are the only two places where you will have all 5 layers. Otherwise, the rest of the body has 4 layers. Stratum corneum on the outside, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basale, working from outside to inside. So, I almost guarantee you there's a test question right there, right? How many layers of the skin do you have on your soles and palms? Oh, I have 5, I have 4, I have 7, I have 22. No, you got 5. Right? 5 is the right answer there. How many layers of skin do you have on the rest of your body, except the palms and the soles? You have 4. Now, other stuff that's in the epidermis. You have these cells that are called melanocytes. Melanocytes have a pigment inside them called melanin, and it is melanin that gives skin its lighter or darker appearance. Melanocytes are cells that sit on the basement membrane alongside the stratum basale. So there they are, sitting alongside the stratum basale, and they have these finger-like projections that project up a few layers higher into the epidermis. And these layers have melanin in them. Now, it turns out that most people in the world, including people who are white or black or Mexican or Chinese or Indian or whatever racial or ethnic profile that you want to, whatever word you want to put to these groups, whatever we call them on a social level, what we do know is that everybody has just about the same number of melanocytes. And you think, wait a minute, don't people who have darker skin have more melanocytes? And it turns out the answer is no, they don't. They have the same number of melanocytes as you do, or as I do, or anybody. What they have is more melanin. If your skin is darker, you have the same number of melanocytes expressing more melanin. If your skin is lighter, you have the same number of melanocytes that are expressing less melanin. That's it. Now, of course, the melanin is there, as it says here, to absorb UV light from sunlight, and it provides a skin color, but it provides a level of protection to the epidermis. It protects skin cells from damaging effects of UV light. Now, of course, the idea there is to protect, especially to protect the stratum basale, because these are the living mitotic cells, we want to protect those cells from damage to the DNA, which would alter their expression of proteins, and that may lead to either cancers or some sort of tumor growth, whatever. The melanocyte is the protection there with its melanin. Right. So there are a number of factors, obviously. Hereditary is, of course, a huge factor in skin color. Of course. We know that. But as it says, most people have the same number of melanocytes, but it's the amount of melanin that those melanocytes make. And of course, if you're in the sun, if you're in a place where there is a lot of sun expressed almost continuously, wherever that is in the world, you're going to tend to have more melanin. And that's a protective device that your melanocytes will make. Now, there's a condition called albinism, which we'll think of as albinos, right? We call the people who have this problem, this disease. We say they're albinos. They inherit a mutation in the melanin genes, and so they lack melanin, and so they appear to be more white or really clear. It's really interesting to look at a person who has albinism. My dog has just entered the scene here. That's why I'm reaching back, and that's why I'm kind of wiggling around, because I'm petting him. He's demanding my attention right now. Obviously, with skin color is influenced by the amount of light that you receive, and UV radiation in particular. So, of course, if you go into a tanning booth and you're tanning, of course, the point there is to absorb more UV light, and so that you develop more melanin and you have a darker skin color. And we in the northern hemisphere somehow think that that's more beautiful or more healthy, or whatever we do on a social level. How we interpret these things is kind of always interesting to me. Physiologic factors, oxygenation in the blood of dermal vessels. This is one of the things that we can use certain colorations in skin in clinical setting. So it's classic to use the part of the nail. We're going to talk about this. There's a part of the nail that looks like kind of a half moon or a quarter moon. It's called the lunula. And the lunula can be an indication of how your vascularity is. If you're well vascularized, if you push on that fingernail, push down on it, it'll blanch. It'll turn white for a brief second, and then you let go. It should immediately or very, very rapidly turn pink again. And that tells us something about our vascularity and blood flow out to the fingertips. That's why we have that pinkish hue, or pinkish, because you can see red blood cells hauling oxygen around, and they have that pinkish appearance. If there is less oxygen in that hemoglobin, if you're reduced in oxygenation, that's a condition that's known as cyanosis. But cyanosis, cyanotic fingertips or lips will have a bluish hue to them, a bluish tint. And that tells you something about the reduction in oxygenation of hemoglobin because of the tint that you can see. Now you also see accumulation of keratin. If you eat, and you'd have to eat a lot of carrots, but if you eat a lot of carrots, you will absorb keratin from the carrots, and that kind of turns your skin almost kind of an orangish color, a slight orangey color. Jaundice is another condition where you will get a buildup of waste products in the body, and jaundice will make the skin appear more yellow, a yellowish appearance to it. All right, that's the epidermis. Now we're going to move on into the dermis. Two layers of the dermis underneath the epidermis. Average is 1 to 2 millimeters thick. It's not very thick. You pick up a ruler and look at how much 1 to 2 millimeters is. It's pretty thin, but it's thick enough to do the job. Now it contains dermal papillae. So the dermal papillae is that scalloped edge that you see there, that up and down, hills and valleys, that's called dermal papillae. That results in what we refer to as epidermal ridges. You will think of them as fingerprints. But the dermal papillae are very pronounced more in the ends of the fingers and toes as well. And we will get what we refer to as fingertips as a result of deeper dermal papillae in those areas. Right, it's mostly connective tissue. There are some muscle fibers, but the muscle fibers are usually connected to, they're smooth muscle, and they're generally connected to either they have something to do with a blood vessel, or they have something to do with a hair follicle. We're going to talk about those structures in a moment. Nerves are found in the dermis. You don't find nerves in the epidermis. So, or at least, well, I shouldn't say you don't find them. You find fewer. Let me say you find fewer nerves in the epidermis. There's a lot of dermal blood supply, of course. Now, you also find these other structures, and we're going to get to these accessory structures, accessory skin structures, hair follicles, sweat, and sebaceous glands. So these are found in the dermis. However, they are extensions of the epidermis. All of these structures, hair follicles, sweat, and sebaceous glands. So if I ask you a question and say, these structures are dermal structures, I have to be very careful when I ask questions about this. I want to make sure that you understand that these structures are epidermal in origin, but they reside in the dermis. Okay, I want to make sure that you understand the distinction between those two things. Yes, so if I point at this hair follicle, I say, look, it's a hair follicle, and you'll say, oh, it originated from the dermis. No, it originated from epidermis, but it resides in the dermis. This is where it gets better strength to hold the hair shaft in place. But the tissue itself, the tissue that creates hair, is of epidermal origin. So there's a difference between where it resides and where did it come from. What tissue did it come from? The tissue it came from is epidermal tissue. Where does it reside? It resides in the dermis. Now you have these different kinds of sensory receptors in the dermis, where you have lamellated corpuscles and tactile corpuscles. Now we're trying to get away, in physiology and anatomy, we're trying to get away from names like Pacinian corpuscle or Meissner's corpuscles, because these are named after people who discovered these things or lent their names to them. We're trying to get away from those kinds of things, so we prefer the terms lamellated corpuscles and tactile corpuscles. So lamellated are for higher pressure, tactile corpuscles are for very, very light touch. All right, dermis again. We got two layers in the dermis. The more superficial layer is referred to as the papillary layer. Papillary, and so think of these ridges and valleys, right? The dermal papilla. That is also where the papillary layer of the dermis is. Makes sense. Right? The papillary layer is areolar connective tissue. It's a little bit less solid than the deeper layer. The deeper layer is the reticular layer, which has dense irregular connective tissue in it. And as the name implies, it's dense, it's thicker, it's heavier, it's more solid, it gives you better grip on things. And of course it is the thicker of the two layers. The thinner, the upper layer, the areolar layer, is where you're going to find a lot of capillarization. You're going to find a lot of blood vessels run through there because it is a little bit thinner. It's a little bit airier, if you will. That's when I hear the word areolar, I always think, well, it's airier, it's thinner, it's wispier. That just means it's easier to get stuff through there. And blood vessels are one of the things that find it easier to get through there. The reticular layer is more supportive. It's denser. It has it gives grip to things, and that's why this hair shaft, right, the root, will sit down in the reticular layer because it gets a nice solid place to reside. All right, so for those three accessory structures, that's where we're at now. The accessory structures that I want you to know about. Three of them: hair follicles, nails, and skin glands. Now there are several kinds of skin glands, especially the two we're really going to get into are sweat and sebaceous glands. Now these are, as the text here says, accessory structures originate from the epidermis. Please understand that. They come from the epidermis. They are epidermal in origin, despite the fact that they live in the dermis. This is a question that I try to hit every year. There will be a question on further tests that will talk about this. They are of epidermal origin, but they reside, they sit, they live in the dermis. All right, nails. You know what nails are, right? You got nails. Nails on the ends of all your fingers. Nails are made of three different parts or components. Remember that the nail itself is part of the integumentary system. The only living part, though, the only growing part of the nail is what we refer to as coming out of this area known as the lunula. So the lunula is this part back here, back in this area of a nail. Back there. Now lunula, because it has to do with the moon, the lunar, the word lune refers to the moon. Well, this has this kind of quarter moon appearance to it. The lunula is the only place where there are actively dividing cells that become your nail. The nail bed, of course, has cells underneath it, but they are not part of the nail. The nail bed is just underneath the nail plate, the part on top, the hard part on top. So, nails grow, cells divide, and then they keratinize. This is keratin, but it's a harder version of keratin. The actively mitotic cells are back here in the lunula, and they push the whole nail plate forward. They just keep pushing from the end of the nail, or from the lunula area, and shoving the rest of the nail out the end until you get a free edge, and it's the free edge that you cut off with fingernail clippers. Now, of course, all of this stuff, the plate on up to the free edge, is not innervated. Thank goodness, because when you cut your nails, you don't feel anything. But if you were to cut it too far back, eventually you're going to run into cells that are adherent to the underlying surface. That's going to hurt. If you have ever had a nail pulled off, and I have, I used to run a lot, and during one of my longer runs, one of the nails got slowly yanked off. That's pretty unpleasant, pretty uncomfortable, but it grows back. It grows back. It takes a long time, but it does grow back. Anyway, there's a nail. Hair follicles. You have three parts to a hair follicle. You got the bulb. The bulb is the base part, the very, very bottom part, the hair bulb. This is where you grow more hair. Right there are the dividing cells that will keratinize and will push more hair from it. So hair, like nails, is actively dividing at the hair bulb, and then it pushes the rest of the shaft out. So older hair is out here, and younger hair is back down at the bottom of the hair follicle at the bulb. Right? The hair shaft is made of obviously dead epidermal cells. Now, down in here, down in the bulb, there is going to be a nourishing supply of capillaries. There will be a capillary bed that surrounds this and nourishes those actively dividing cells. There's also another structure, and this was mentioned in a couple slides ago, but there is a muscle, a smooth muscle. When we get to muscles, we'll find out there's three kinds of muscle. There's skeletal muscle, there's cardiac muscle, your heart, of course, and there's smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is under the control of the autonomic nervous system for the most part. And there's a muscle attached to the root inside the dermis, and it's called the Erector Pili muscle. The Erector Pili is active when you get goosebumps, right? When you get goosebumps, that lifts the hair up. So the Erector Pili muscle takes this hair that's lying against your skin and lifts it up. So when you get creeped out by something or you get scared, if you've seen a dog who gets upset at, say, another dog or another animal, the back of the hair on its neck or the upper part of its back, those are called hackles. That's what's happening with the dog. The Erector Pili muscle is picking up the shaft of the hair back there on the hackles, and they pick up, make them look bigger, makes them look more intimidating. Not sure what it does for us. I certainly don't look bigger and more intimidating when I get goosebumps. You have glands in your skin. Of course, you know this. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles, but only in certain parts of the body. There's a couple of parts where they are not found. And I'll tell you right away, absent on palms and soles. So sebaceous glands are usually associated with hair follicles, but you do not have sebaceous glands on your palms or soles. Test question, hint, hint, hint. And they produce this material called sebum, and that's where you get this word sebaceous from. Sebum is a fatty material that contains cellular debris, but it also acts as a lubricant to the hair shaft. It acts to help the hair shaft be waterproof. Again, it's not completely waterproof, but it's pretty good. It's pretty water resistant. A disease associated with the excess production of sebum is acne. This is another reason to keep your skin clean. And there are treatments that are associated with the excess production of sebum, which leads to acne. But remember, it's absent on palms and soles. Okay. So, associated with hair shafts, it is a holocrine gland. Okay, holocrine glands. So, when you in lab, when you studied tissue types, you should have learned about glands. But holocrine glands are glands that the secretion that comes from a holocrine gland is really the entire cell itself that has, I won't say it destroyed itself. It doesn't destroy itself, but it does. The whole cell, the plasma membrane around that cell ruptures, and all of the contents inside that cell are the secreted contents from that cell. So a sebaceous gland is a holocrine gland in that sense. The sebaceous secretion, the sebum, is really the entire inside of the cell that has turned into this fatty and cellular debris material is expressed in sebum. Not all glands are like that. In fact, very few glands are holocrine glands, but sebaceous glands are holocrine. We're going to talk about different kinds of glands when we get to other ones. Here we go. Okay, more skin glands, sweat glands. You really have two big kinds of sweat glands. The one that you're more used to is this one, what are called Apocrine or Merocrine sweat glands. These glands are found almost all over the body, with a couple of exceptions. They are the things that you know and love about sweat glands, right? They're the things that keep you cool when it's a hot day in the summer or you're exercising and when you sweat. The sweat that you think about, that watery substance that comes to the surface of the skin, is coming from the Eccrine gland, right? As it says, responds to elevated body temperature, trying to keep you cool. That's really the point. Here is a Merocrine or Eccrine sweat gland, right? It's tubular in shape, and it is not associated with a hair shaft. Now, that doesn't mean it's not near hair shafts. It's just not associated directly with a hair shaft. So it's over here, and it's got this coiled structure, and the sweat is manufactured and comes out through a pore in your skin in response to heat. So it's trying to keep you cool. That's the point of a Merocrine sweat gland. There's another sweat gland that you have called an Apocrine sweat gland. Apocrine sweat glands are found in two big areas of the body, and that is the axillary and groin area. So axillary is your armpit, and groin is groin, between the legs, or where the legs meet the pelvis. They tend to be more odor-producing, odoriferous, and so, odoriferous. They do not secrete by an eccrine function, meaning that just means that the Merocrine sweat gland produces the fluid that we call sweat, mostly water with some ions in it. That produces the fluid in here, and that fluid, the fluid itself that is produced by the cells, it's the fluid that makes its way up through the duct up to your skin. As opposed to the other, remember the Holocrine gland that we just talked about, that is the entire cell breaking down, and the entire cell becomes the secretion. Apocrine glands of all kinds, but apocrine sweat glands are an example of that. Apocrine glands are kind of halfway in between, right? It's not the whole cell that is expressed and becomes the secretion, and it's not just a cell creating a secretion. It's kind of in the middle. Parts of the cell will bleb off. We refer to that as blebbing. It secretes the material by exocytosis. So these granules or small these small vesicles that are created that have the material, the sweat in them, but also have odoriferous compounds in there. They're secreted by exocytosis. Now, this is typically, as it says, responds to emotions or pain or other stimuli that are not just simply heat related. You're not just simply trying to cool the body down. They're responding to a more emotional situation, I suppose. These tend to be more, as I say, they tend to have an odor associated with them, whereas most of the time a Merocrine sweat gland does not have an odor attached to it. Now, this is quite variable, obviously quite variable from person to person. So I can't say there's no odor, it's just not as pungent or powerful as an apocrine sweat gland would be. You have a couple other glands. The ceruminous glands. Ceruminous glands produce earwax in the ear canal, and mammary glands also produce milk. Men and women both have mammary glands. It's just that they're mostly non-functional in men because we don't have the right hormonal cocktail that is necessary to make them active. Oh, geez, this thing's not moving forward. Come on, slideshow. Here we go. Right, so here's a table, usual table of the stuff you need to know. Sebaceous glands, right, those are holocrines. The Merocrine sweat glands, the apocrine sweat glands, ceruminous glands, mammary glands. All right, skin functions. What does the skin do? Well, you know some of the stuff it does. It protects, protective barrier against harmful substances and microorganisms. It is huge. I said it before, I'll say it again. The protective role that your epidermis and dermis play in the prevention of disease is huge. It's just huge. It's the first line of defense, for sure. As it says, prevents some water loss, not all of it. I mean, when you breathe out, you're breathing water. When you just sit there, you say, I'm not sweating. Well, you are. You're just not. It's just not collecting on the surface of your skin. But you're trying to keep yourself cool that way too, so there's some water loss. Obviously, you urinate, you lose water that way. When you defecate, you lose some water that way as well. But some of that is prevented by the skin. Obviously, there are sensory receptors. This is your connection to the outside world predominantly, at least through touch and cutaneous sensation. You get some waste excretion through the skin. Produce vitamin D, that has all to do with UV radiation activating vitamin D3, and that UV is necessary to activate vitamin D3 into a more active form. And then, of course, it regulates body temperature, obviously. So, body temperature, a slight shift. Body temperature is 37 degrees. 37 degrees C, 98.6 Fahrenheit. That's where, as a homeotherm, that's where you want to stay. A homeotherm is an organism that makes its own heat. You are one of those, right? And so your skin helps you to regulate that. It makes you cooler when it's too hot. It makes you warmer, or at least it keeps in heat that you are trying to produce through muscle activity. Skin plays a role in that homeostatic balance. Now, heat loss. As I said, you're producing heat. You're a homeotherm. You're making heat. You got to regulate that. You got to balance it out. Skeletal and cardiac muscles are huge producers of heat energy through the breakdown of ATP. As you know, we went through that whole process, right? 40% goes into chemical work, chemical energy. The other 50 to 60% is thrown off as heat. That's where you generate body heat. Now, you can lose heat in any of these ways, right? You can radiate. Now, when we say radiation, that doesn't mean that you're radioactive. It just means you are radiating heat, right? You are a source of heat, and so if we put an infrared camera on you, we're going to see you radiating heat away from your body. Conduction is where the heat moves from the skin to cooler objects. So if you're out running and you have, a wicking t-shirt on or wicking garment on, that can pull sweat away from your skin and further to the environment. And so you're going to conduct more heat away from the body in that way. Convection is like a convection oven. It's similar to conduction, but now you have to have an air current. You have to have an air current, like having a fan on you. You're still radiating heat. The heat might be conducted through your shirt. If you have a fan on you, that will add convection as another way to get rid of excess heat. And of course, obviously, evaporation. Evaporation changes the liquid sweat, liquid water, into a gas. And when it does that, the chemistry of it is when you have a liquid and the liquid evaporates, it takes energy to make that transition from liquid to gas. That takes energy, and that energy is lost in the form of heat. You know this when you boil water. Right? When you boil water, you have to add heat to liquid water. When you have liquid water, it just sits there. When you add heat to it, it starts to boil, and so it takes that excess heat that you made it boil and pulls it out and becomes a gas. So that's evaporation. Now, the usual figure 8 phenomena here, regulating body temperature, right? The hypothalamus has the job of measuring your body temperature through various sources, not the least of which is literally blood flow through the hypothalamus. And there is energy, there's heat energy associated with that, and your hypothalamus has ways to evaluate that. If you vasodilate blood vessels, especially of the dermis, vasodilation means making them bigger. If you make them bigger, more blood flows through them, and they are more likely to get rid of excess heat energy. On the other hand, if you're cold, you want to retain that heat, and so you will get vasoconstriction of dermal blood vessels. You'll have smaller blood vessels, less blood going to your skin. You want to retain that blood and retain the heat with that blood inside your body. Sweat glands are activated, of course, when body temperature goes up. They are deactivated when body temperature goes down. That's all under the regulation of the autonomic nervous system. If you get really cold, you will start to shiver. That is an involuntary muscle contraction. You shiver so that, because we know that shivering is a muscularly active activity, and that will cause muscles to work harder. Well, when muscles work harder, they have to burn more ATP. When they burn ATP, they shed heat. That's how you make yourself warmer, is by shivering. All right. Now, skin, the things that are associated with skin, you've got hyperthermia and hypothermia, of course. Hyperthermia means, literally, the root word here is thermia. That's temperature. Hyper, too much temperature, abnormally high body temperature. Now, you have to be able to regulate that. So humans are pretty good about living in a lot of different environments where there are pretty big alterations in temperature. We can live in desert regions in the world. We live in chronically cold regions in the world. I mean, yes, we all have our preferences, but we have we reside in all parts of the world for the most part. There are some extremes that that we tend to avoid. All right. Hyperthermia will affect the body. If you can't, so these conditions, hyperthermia and hypothermia, mean that your body is not regulating its temperature adequately. That means you're supposed to be 37 C. At hyperthermia, you could be 39, 39.5. Your skin becomes dry. You get weak. You get dizzy. You get nauseous, headaches, rapid pulse. These are all ways in which your body is trying to deal with that excess body heat. It's trying to get rid of it, but it's not being successful. On the other hand, hypothermia is the other way. Too cold. Your body is not making enough heat. It's either losing heat too quickly, or you are not able to make enough heat to keep yourself in a homeothermic situation. Right? So hypothermia means you're losing heat. Homeotherm means you're maintaining the same body heat. Hyperthermia means you are too hot. Now, a lot of these are similar, progressive confusion, lethargy, loss of reflexes and consciousness. Without treatment, organs will shut down. Yeah. You can die from hypothermia. This is the last one. I thought that might have been the last line. So I've indicated some of these things that happen to the integumentary system over time. Cell cycle slows down, so you don't replace skin. It's the stratum basale that is the only actively mitotic layer of your skin, and those cells need to replace all of the layers above them constantly throughout your entire life. Well, if the cell cycle slows down and you're not making as many, those cells are not reproducing as fast as they once were, well, then the skin is going to be hanging around longer than it used to. And so when you used to shed your skin on a fairly regular basis, you would get rid of anything that might become scaly or age spots or whatever. Now they tend to hang around. Darn it. Right, the epidermis and the dermis become thinner. That's a classic thing over time. And certain medications, long-term medications. Prednisone is a classic one for making thin skin, thin, very breakable, easily breakable skin. We call it friable skin. Prednisone is responsible for that, and prednisone is used in a lot of diseases to mitigate some of the problems with those diseases. You tend to lose subcutaneous fat. I wouldn't mind losing some subcutaneous fat right now, but you need that subcutaneous fat layer to insulate the body, to keep the body at the right temperature. People start to feel cold. And wrinkling, sagging of the skin, of course you know this, the elasticity, elastin, that collagenous, the elastic collagenous fibers called elastin, they are not as elastic, and of course the cell cycle slows down with those fibroblasts that are making that, and you lose elasticity of the skin. It starts to sag. Sebaceous glands secrete less oil. Your skin becomes dry. Remember I said that. That helps to keep your... Now you might say, well, I want shampoos and I want to get rid of this sebaceous crap, this sebum that's on my hair. It's oily. Yeah, well, don't worry. When you get older, you won't have to worry about it. It'll happen all by itself. Melanin production slows down. The hair whitens. Yes, it does. Hair thins. Hair follicles, number of hair follicles decrease. Older people tend to have fewer hair follicles, especially toward their hands and toward their feet. Distal places on the body. Sensory receptors decline. You become less sensitive to changes in temperature, less sensitive to changes or to objects that you step on that could be dangerous, and you pierce that thin skin and you have problems. Body temperature regulation is harder, and you have a diminished ability to produce vitamin D. All of these things are lifespan changes, and to various extents, to different extents in different people, of course, obviously. All right, I believe that's it. Yes, right. So, okay, so that's integumentary system. I will provide you with a study guide for this stuff, which will, basically reinforce all of this stuff that's been going on here. Kudos to NASA for landing another rover on Mars, and then we'll see some cool pictures from that. And along with the other stuff, we're kind of populating Mars now with a lot of stuff, and I'm a little concerned that we're leaving our garbage there, just like we like to leave our garbage here. But that's another story for another time. Thanks for your attention. I will see you in a little bit with another topic. In fact, I haven't even looked at what the next topic is, but I will look at that now. Thanks for your attention.